With our mammoth episode 1 complete, it is time to dive into the life of the Burning Crusade. Its raiding high points, how PvP changed, what people actually did to gear up their characters, and so much more, as we essentially see Blizzard work out what World of Warcraft actually is and is going to be, and all as it sets subscriber record after subscriber record. Let's begin with the big one. What many people assumed would be the end raid of the expansion, even though of course it wasn't. We're going to begin with the Black Temple. The Black Temple has been at the center of every event on the world of Draenor. It was once Karabor, the Temple of the Light, at the heart of the Draenei civilization. It was then taken by the Shadow Council, who corrupted the orcs into, of course, the bloodthirsty horde. Ner'zhul then summoned countless portals from its peak, of course, shattering Draenor and turning it into Outland. Now, in TBC, it is the seat of Illidan Stormrage, the Lord of Outland. Illidan had used the time since Warcraft 3, the Frozen Throne, to make Outland a fortress against any invader. The war raged outside Black Temple for months since launch, but on the 5th of June 2007, the Alliance and the Horde finally found a crack in the fortress walls, and with that, raids flooded into the Black Temple, fighting their way from the frost-resist loving Najantis through Supremus and into the temple itself, and 4 encounters that could be done in any order. Of course, there's a shade of Akama, who needed some tight chains of CC in the ads. There's Terran Gorefiend, the first Death Knight, and the boss who would turn you into a ghost. And of course, the gear check of Gurtog Bloodboil. And finally, for this stage of the raid, the Reliquary of Souls, with its 3 unique phases. One with impossible healing, one focused on interrupting and reflecting, and one with amplified DPS threat. Yeah. When all the DPS players generate more threat, that causes a fun time for the tanks. Each of these was, of course, its own tricky thing to play around. With those bosses dead then, groups would enter the Den of Mortal Delights, a callback to the Maiden of Pain chamber in Warcraft 3. Now, the encounter with Lady Sharaz demanded Shadow Resist gear. Resist gear, that's the sort of thing that is long gone from the game today. Our penultimate fight was against the Illidari Council, a Blood Elf, Paladin, Rogue, Mage, and Priest. Beat them! And it was time to fight the Burning Crusade's primary villain, Illidan. Finally, it was time to summit the Black Temple and take on Illidan himself, in what would be remembered as a truly epic fight, and for a few reasons. Akama saw our invasion of the Black Temple as his time to strike, to finally get payback. So he joined us in the Temple Mount. He confronted Illidan, the oft-repeated, "You are not prepared," was shouted, and with that, the encounter began. Well, to start, Illidan had some pretty hefty melee attacks. He could shear a target's HP by 60%. That pressured the tanks pretty hard. Time management was also key here, as Illidan cast Parasitic Shadow Fiend. This was a manageable debuff, causing 3,000 damage per tick, and jumping to extra targets. And that meant that it slowly spread itself throughout the raid, becoming very sore in the healers. Phase 2 is quite an iconic one. It kicks off with Illidan flying up into the air, tossing down his glaives to the ground, and summoning in 2 elementals, which had to be dealt with care. And those elementals and their mechanic, well, they would even annoy soloers for a little while longer, far past the relevance of this fight to gearing. Deal with those, and Illidan would crash down to the ground in his demonic form. And then it became a DPS race, as Illidan's aura of dread inflicted 1k damage per second to every member of the raid, amongst a whole host of other powerful demonic abilities that he had as well. Of course, as the fight drew to a close, Maiev Shadowsong rushed to join the battle. And with that, Illidan was dead. So we thought-ish at the time. There was, of course, minor payoff for Maev's story at the end, but really that was that. Suffice to say, lore nuts were not impressed with Illidan's treatment, and really a bunch of the lore in this expansion. Now, of course, what we all remember is the loot. I mean, for me, it's the black bow of the Betrayer as a hunter, but also, of course, the Warglaives of Azzinoth. Although nominally a rogue weapon, many Fury warriors demanded a chance to roll on these, and really, the glaives would be a bit of a guild breaker. So much personal drama, raid leaders ninjing, class leaders ninjing. It was a big old disaster, really, but it was a highly memorable weapon. I think in terms of the game design, it did its job. It was the thing, the North Star for so many players, and it drove so much gameplay. It wasn't just that, though. Players, of course, would have been working through their Tier 6 armor sets and all of that, and of course they had been working from Tier 4, from Gruul's Lair, Magtharidan's Lair, and Karazhan, gradually up towards Tier 5 in Serpent Shrine Cavern and Tempest Keep, and then finally collected Tier 6 from Hyjal and the Black Temple. The power and aesthetic felt like a fitting reward for clearing every dungeon, every heroic dungeon and all the raids multiple times, so that when you saw somebody, and I remember this personally, I saw a warrior walking around with the Bulwark of Azzinoth and one of the glaives. Maybe it wasn't the ideal loadout, but I'll tell you what, as an aspiring warrior who didn't know what was going on, I wanted to be that guy. We do have to deal with a rather confusing thing. Hyjal was technically a launch raid, but Hyjal was only cleared after the Black Temple, a patch raid, was put into the game. Even though, of course, technically Hyjal was the Burning Crusade launch content. Now, this is, of course, how it went down for the top raiders like Insidia and Nihilum, right? They killed Black Temple, and very shortly after, Archimonde went down. But you have to remember that for the vast majority of the Burning Crusade's players, raiding didn't really operate that way. It was not that bleeding edge. Nowadays, we expect to clear a raid on normal difficulty on launch day, or maybe a few days after. We expect to clear it on heroic not that long after that, maybe a few weeks, depending what your guild is like. While here, in Outland, gear acquisition was slower. Gear felt relevant for longer. Item level inflation was smaller. The whole pace of World of Warcraft was different. As we covered, for some things, you need to get maybe frost resist gear, shadow resist gear. All of this meant that content lasted far longer than really modern standards would have you believe and expect. So it was experienced differently, and this content stood to the game for a very long time. Of course, with kael'thas, Lady Vash, Archimonde, and Illidan defeated, you really could be forgiven for just thinking that that was it for the Burning Crusade. No, far from it. It's time to talk about patch 2.2 and 2.3. Patch 2.2, the voice chat patch. Blizzard's doomed attempt, their first attempt at voice chat, launched with this patch, and while it may have seemed like a good idea at the time, Ventrilo and TeamSpeak were already the dominant thing for World of Warcraft players. I mean, Ventrilo would be integrated with your guild's website. Oh yeah, guilds all had websites back then. Bit different to today. Now, while Blizzard's voice chat came by default, it was of course completely outmatched by what players were already using. Plus, having your voice communications die when your client crashes or you get DC'd, well, that truly would suck. Another notorious change from patch 2.2 was the first area of effect damage cap. Yeah, it happened then too. AoE spells would now have a maximum damage output instead of scaling linearly per, additional mobs. This, of course, curtailed mage dungeon farming, but it didn't make it impossible. And of course, it's something I remember experiencing, and many other hunters will, whenever they used volley in the initial trash of Icecrown Citadel. All those skeletons would come in, and you'd notice you'd be doing the same amount of damage, just the damage per mob would decrease. Of course, many years later, Shadowlands would tackle a similar problem with its AoE cap. Just instead of capping max damage, it capped targets. Controversial. Patch 2.2, though, really was not a large patch. I think Blizzard thought that voice stuff would be a larger feature for players than it was. It really wasn't. And by this stage of patch 2.2, the launch of the Burning Crusade had stabilized. Now, we've talked about attunements, stuff like that, but you might be wondering, how did people actually gear their characters? Just what the hell did they do? Patch 2.2 was 8 months post-launch, and even then, the player base was expanding rapidly. New people hit Endgame every day, and in a world where levels 1 through 70 took many newbies many months, it meant that the Burning Crusade really wasn't an Endgame-only experience. For those who did ding, though, the standard path, of course, was to get geared, and as we covered in the last episode, to progress through their attunements. Now, the more casual-minded out there, well, they would be dabbling in the odd dungeon here and there, getting a little bit of gear, maybe playing around with some alts, farming up some gold for their epic flying, and maybe sampling the expansion's many reputations and daily quests. To get geared, though, well, this is what you would do. The first place to look was professions, right? So craftable pre-raid, best-in-slot BOEs were plentiful enough, and the auction house was handy. You got things like the Fellstalker armor for hunters, which was pretty great. The 3-part set gave you plus 20 hit, and that was pretty damn nice. But of course, if you wanted to maximize benefit from professions, well, you would actually have to make some gear yourself, because craftable bind-on pickup stuff, it was serious business. And here, rogues are a handy example. Engineering was a bit of a must for them at certain points because of the bind-and-pick-up helm called Death Blow Goggles. They were a very common sight in PvP. So, with your professions thought out, questing would then be a next step, and you could actually begin this at level 68. As an example, the Helm of the Claw, that was picked up from a quest to kill Warlord, big lore name, in the Steam Vault. Not as strong as those engineering goggles, of course, but firmly on the pre-raid best-in-slot gear list. Another great example is the brother against brother chain that sent players into Sethic Halls, right? It had something for nearly every class, like, say, the Mark of the Raven Guard, which was a tank pre-raid best-in-slot, the Oracle's Focus, which was on the healing pre-raid best-in-slot, right? All this great stuff to just go do some quests for. So with professions and questing done, reputations were another thing to think about. Warlocks and Paladins would target the Keepers of Time faction for the Continuum Sword, which would of course get them into Karazhan. Where Paladins then could, they could pick up the Shard of the Virtuous, Warlocks get the Nathrazim Mind Blade, a lot of stuff from reps. What next then, beyond reps? Well, beyond getting yourself attuned, you would need to think about, of course, heroic dungeon gear and raid gear. And this is really when people in established groups and guilds, well, they would do just fine, right? They could be propelled through that content geared up by their team. That's the thing. Being in a guild really did make your life easier. It really did give you access to actually doing the whole breadth of the expansion. And I imagine that because of this, and I think Blizzard have said as much, the number of new raiders would sort of dwindle a bit over time, right? Because there were those barriers to entry. And of course, guilds would want to focus on the new content, the new progression. That would get to the point where they'd work out their roster, enough people would stick around, and they wouldn't feel the need to gear up as many newbies. Perhaps that is why Blizzard actually changed the general design of gear and how raids actually operated so much in Wrath of the Lich King, because of course Wrath had a lot more in the way of catch-up gear, and it very much had raid tiers replacing the prior raid tiers, far more so than in the Burning Crusade. But still, even if you were playing regularly in a group, RNG may not favor you. And this is where the Burning Crusade's next big system comes in: Badges of Justice. New in the Burning Crusade, badges would drop from heroic dungeon bosses and from many raid bosses. So doing a dungeon could net you a few of these badges. Now, if that dungeon was a daily heroic, then the daily heroic quest would get you another 2 badges. So you get some badges this way, but in a way, raids were really the ideal way to get them, because the first boss of a raid would drop 1, the final boss would drop 3, and all the rest would drop 2. Now that would mean, for example, that a full clear of Black Temple would get you 18 badges. Where do these badges go? Well, they go to the Badge of Justice vendor, Geras. Now, initially, that NPC sold Karazhan level gear in terms of the tuning. And this Justice gear ranged from 25 to 50 badges apiece, and that meant that you could quite reasonably farm up a slot of gear a week. Pretty sweet, right? Now, there weren't that many options at first, and it really did serve as more just a way to fill out some odd slots that fell through the RNG cracks. It was a welcome system for many players. However, it was not until patch 2.3 that it really kicked off, because 2.3 is when Badges of Justice saw their golden age begin. Geras had a new selection of gear, and that selection was vast. It covered far more slots, and it was of a significantly higher item level. Of course, that coincided with the new raid, Zul'Aman. Now, for the raiders, this was really handy. For the large groups of people who did dungeons but couldn't really get into raiding, this was also massive because the badges that they would earn via their heroic dungeon runs, those could lead to genuinely great gear. And what's more is that patch 2.3 added Badges of Justice to the Karazhan boss loot tables. Now this was big. Karazhan, of course, was the Burning Crusade's most puggable raid, by far. And that meant that the combo of pugging Karazhan and then doing heroic dungeons for badges, that was a big way for people to gear up. But of course, that was far from all that patch 2.3 gave us, because we had big game changes and, of course, a new raid. Gods of Zul'Aman brought us back to the Blood Elf leveling storyline of the Ghostlands and the Trolls. Now, Zede was a new 10-player raid, one that brought Zul'Jin in, and it was actually Blizzard's second of their new style of raid release cutscenes, this time showing us the Troll War. Zul'Jin's VO described a pretty one-sided war, casting the forest trolls as these sympathetic villains. But we were, of course, going to go in there to kill the whole lot of them, so that we could get the Amani warbear. Of course, if you trace the DNA of the BT machinima and this machinima forward, you get the Wrathgate. And really, the Wrathgate was not too long after this. Now, the actual in-game reason for us to go to Zul'Aman is in fact to pay off a grifting adventurer named Bud Nedrick to pay off his debts. I'll say as Alliance, it was pretty damn cool to land at this neutral flight point inside an otherwise horde-looking camp that was deep within the enemy territory. Going there to do endgame content felt like you're in the frontier. Real cool. Now, what was amazing about this raid was the timed event, where the first 4 bosses would have a hostage. Now, every hostage you saved equaled more loot for you, and you started with a 20-minute timer on the clock. So you'd have to race through this raid real quick before the hostages got sacrificed by the bosses. But with each boss adding 5 minutes to the timer, well, let's just say it could get very clenchy, but well worth the reward, because if you save all 4 hostages, you get the Amani warbear. And a year to the day later, Wrath of the Lich King released. And with that, the warbear was removed from the game. It was only earnable for 1 calendar year, and that means that having this in your account is a true mark of veterancy. After returning the blood of Zul'Jin to Bud Nedrick, he decided to take credit for our victory. But the joke was on him, because the very spirits that he angered when he cast the blood into a nearby fire did believe that it was his victory. So they were a bit vengeful and they set him in fire. Sucks for him. Bud would survive, actually, eventually finding his way to Northrend, being in Wrath of the Lich King, and even being in parts of Cataclysm before his final appearance in World of Warcraft as a garrison quest giver in patch 6.1. Now, this patch did bring other changes to the game, such as a revamp to leveling. And this was real big, right? With experience requirements being dropped between levels 20 and 60, elite mobs throughout the old zones being returned to basically being soloable. I mean, look, leveling was still a gigantic effort at this time, but with this much welcome change, alts became a lot less daunting. Other changes that remain with us until today are, say, the guild bank and the blue coloration of daily quest markers. Now that guild bank, I mean, if we're going to talk about the guild bank and the Burning Crusade, we have got to talk about, well, the next level up from ninja looting that bit of gear that the raid leader wants in the raid or something, and that is looting the guild bank. Whew. I actually, personally, at one point did plan to pull off a guild bank heist. To the guild I played with for the longest time, don't worry, it wasn't you guys, it was way before. I didn't do it though. But I think we all know why one would want to do that. Well, ninjing the guild bank, this happened to well-established guilds. When it happened, it shook servers. It set the forums on fire. And there's many reasons why somebody would do it. I mean, for me, it was pure greed and assholery. But for others, it could be frustration at being overlooked in loot distribution. Perhaps you are the guild bank officer of your guild. You're also a rogue, and you don't get the Warglaives of Azeroth. Maybe you take it out in the guild. Maybe it's sheer greed. Maybe it's just good old-fashioned trolling. And to top it off, Blizzard's policy was that if you trusted somebody enough to give them access to the guild bank, well, then they wouldn't do anything about it because you placed your trust in that person. It was your fault. Now, before we venture to the Isle of Quel'Danas, we really must venture over to PvP. The Burning Crusade brought with it the arena system. What an awesome thing. And this quickly became the pinnacle of PvP. I mean, sure, the Eye of the Storm battleground was fun and we all enjoy blasting people off into the nether till this very day, but arena, that is where it was at. There was a new arena season with each patch, and each season's gear rewards were of similar power levels to that patch's raid tier. Of course, more of the stat budget for arena gear went towards things like resilience. And that did mean that, sure, it might have been the same item level as raid gear, but stat-wise, it would not produce the same throughput, so you wouldn't really want to use it for raiding. But of course, that didn't stop many people, myself included, trying to grind out some welfare epics by chain queuing Alteric Valley for absurd amounts of time, especially when it was the double honor weekend. Because that was a thing in the old battleground system. With Arena then, well, you'd form a team. That's pretty different to today. And then you'd start queuing. And the cycle was simple. Queue, win matches, get currency, buy gear, win matches, and so on. There are lots of interesting details and intricacies, such as how your rewards are actually given to you, at the end of the week and all of that. But those don't matter too much for this video. The point is, you did your Arena. Now, perhaps you wanted more though, more than just gear. Well, arena titles and mounts were the ultimate prestige. The top 10 to 15% got the Challenger title, 3% through 10% got Rival, the top 3% to 0.5% got Duelist, and finally, the heroes, the champions, the badasses, the top 0.5% of arena teams in each battle group, they received the Gladiator title and the Armored Nether Drake. I cannot express to you how much this was one of the coolest mounts in the game, bar none. Because, you could get a Nether Drake by doing the Netherwing reputation and all that stuff, and you could get Ashes of Alar by being extremely lucky. But to be the best of the best in the new arena PvP system, so good you got that mount, sitting there in town with your full PvP set that looked incredible, you were just the badass if you had that. And that was, again, a North Star. Much like how many raiders wanted the Warglaives and the Bulwark of Azeroth, this is what the PvPers aspired to. Blizzard realized that this was catching on. And to try to make good on it, they introduced the Global Arena Tournament servers, which was also a way for them to make some money because you had to pay a one-time entry fee for those servers. But if you're a serious arena team, it was the place to be because it was a server made just for you. There, Blizzard had all their PvE content disabled. They would then give people 3 max level characters, with each having the best possible gear loadout for that class and spec. And then it was time to do some arena. Blizzard, of course, investing in these servers really did show that arena prestige was a big thing and that this esports thing could actually catch on a bit. As much as the world first races were exciting, that was tied to the release of a raid. An arena tournament, though, well, that could be hosted whenever, perhaps just like a StarCraft tournament with their other popular esport. And this essentially was the seed of the WoW esports scene. At BlizzCon 2008, teams competed over a $120,000 prize pool, and they played to a huge audience. Quite incredible that all this was going on, and it all does seem great, and it was great. But there was a casualty. There was. The old way of PvP in vanilla. Something I'm sure you've heard much of since Classic. Sure, Blizzard tried to spread some zone objectives across Outland, but they didn't really see much play. They didn't see as much play as Blizzard and players would have liked, I think. There was a marked shift in PvP gameplay, one that really wouldn't be undone. And that was one towards arenas and battleground grinding. Because in a world where those instances, where that's really where your rewards came from, and you had these PvP objectives, but also flying mounts, really changing world content PvP, yeah, PvP, it moved to the instance and away from the world. And I think that's why, for all of its issues, vanilla's PvP is so fondly remembered as a unique and special thing. Well, by this stage in the expansion and this video, the Outland ecosystem was complete, right? Characters, they went through their attunement processes while getting their catch-up gear from Karazhan and Zul'Aman, where of course Blizzard's 10-player catch-up raid idea really did seem to work, especially with how it tied into the badge gear. And that really is how it went. You found your pre-raid base, you did your reputations, you went for it, you got your attunements, you did your reputations, you tried to earn some gold for your epic flying, which of course really meant farming primals for untold hours near the Throne of Elements. Maybe you would find a pug of ZA or Kara if you liked. Maybe you'd do so well in that pug you'd actually make your way into the guild. And then bam, this massive journey of raid progression would open up. An incredible thing. And really that is the thing. That's my point here. In TBC, in this era, the basics of character progression took ages. I mean, sure, you could get screwed in RNG, but, having badges as a fallback, it kind of made up for that, so it was this slow march forward, where it all felt a lot more meaningful. And this is just a world where the game was slower, and it all worked excellently. Also, not to mention that at this stage, many people, like myself for much of it, we were leveling our characters up. World of Warcraft was young. It was not the endgame only experience that it is now. And that meant that its design parameters, even player expectations, they were very different. Great as this was, the Burning Crusade was about to go out with a bang. The final patch of the Burning Crusade was immense, and it was dedicated to the godfather of modern fantasy RPGs, Gary Gygax, for he had died at around that time. It also marked a first for World of Warcraft. The idea of a patch zone was actually born here. The Isle of Quel'Danas hosted a quest hub, 5-man dungeon, and our final raid, Sunwell Plateau. It was also where the Burning Crusade finally justified its name, because a lot of those weird things we fought were actually Illidan related, and Illidan did not like the Burning Crusade. Yeah, this is when the Burning Crusade actually came to Azeroth. It had another, at the time, amazing patch trailer with kael'thas telling us what happened to the High Elves. That the Sunwell had been destroyed, sending his people on an exodus where they would take on the name Blood Elves and serve Illidan, join the Illidari. But then he tells us that the salvation Illidan promised was not enough. No. And of course then, that in secret kael'thas had began using fel energy. This, predictably, had corrupted him. And that's when he met Kil'jaeden. Kil'jaeden, who commanded him to summon Kil'jaeden to Azeroth via a rebuilt Sunwell. The Shattar and the Blood Knights, loyal to Silvermoon, formed up the Shattered Sun offensive, and they launched a counter-invasion of the Isle of Quel'Danas. And that was this patch. Landing for the first time, it was just such a big change from the dark weirdness of Outland. It really was. It was bright. It was alive with magic. It was that gorgeous Blood Elf aesthetic. You had Naga, demons, kael'thas loyalists, even Murlocs, wretched fighters as well, all fighting this grinding war across the beach and up to the shore towards the towering structure of the Sunwell Plateau. It was just cool. It also was not just a single set of dailies. This was awesome. Quel'Danas, like the Throne of Thunder that would come much later, progressed server-wide. On launch day, all you had was a tiny little base. But as the days and weeks rolled on, more and more ground was captured, unlocking new daily quests, gear vendors, and more. Max out progression, and your server would unlock a buff from the Naru Kiru. Pretty neat. And while simple, this undoubtedly was a cool thing, especially because it was new, it was novel for the time. The Isle of Quel'Danas quickly became a daily fixture for many people as they worked their way through that reputation bar, of course trying to get their Shattered Sun tabard. Now the Isle also brought with it new Badge of Justice gear. Eye level 141, even better than what patch 2.3 brought, meaning that yes, even for the casual players, a whole new set of rewards was opened up here, and for the raiders, that they would be able to fill in their missing slots from the raid content. Overall then, this place was just so damn memorable. The art was gorgeous, it was incredible, the enemies looked cool, the zone progression was a neat, novel new thing. The dungeon was also awesome. And even just visually, the likes of that bombing quest that took you over the masses of Legion forces and the big pit lord, well man, that was all just cool. So, onwards to the raid. There wasn't an achievement process, and it was open from launch, but it was time-gated over 2 months, so anticipation for each wing opening up was really quite massive. Now, the raid's first 3 bosses opened 2 weeks after patch day. The reason why everybody wanted to down these bosses was, of course, the new Tier 6 gear that these bosses dropped. The set was expanded from 6 to 9 pieces, with Kael'thas, Brutalis, and Felmist dropping the new Bracer's belt and boots. So a bit different from a set piece perspective, really. Now, the first gate opening unlocked the Eridar twins encounter. The second gate led us to the Muru Entropius encounter, which was, of course, the culmination of the big Blood Elf Paladin storyline that Blizzard had been developing throughout, especially the start of the Burning Crusade. A very neat glimpse into the future as well, in terms of cosmic stuff, and also quite an iconic boss. I think less because it was a great fight, and more because it was absolutely hard as nails and blocked a lot of groups. By this stage, the third gate's opening was hotly anticipated, and I think we all know who that would be. Even only being half summoned in, Kil'jaeden was still a real tough encounter. He'd only clawed his way partially into our reality, but with that, the raid had to quickly down his many demonic minions. And as he pulled himself upright, the third phase of this fight would fire off, and Kil'jaeden would cast Darkness of 1,000 Souls, dealing 47.5k damage to everybody. But luckily, the Blue Dragonflight was on hand to drop down some shield orbs. Of course, all a coordination test for the players. And in the final climactic bit of that fight, kael'thas' Phoenix sacrificed itself, giving the raid a 25% boost to light damage, so that healers could actually switch up to DPS and race against Kil'jaeden's increasingly frequent and deadly mechanics. Finally, Kil'jaeden was pushed back into the twisting nether. He was defeated, But as, of course, Legion would show, he was very much not dead. Now, his loot really did match the encounter's difficulty. The legendary bow, Thoradal Star's Fury, was the highest DPS bow in the game until well into Wrath. Though greatly, that is because the bow did not use ammo. Because yes, ammo existed at the time. You'd have to slot in ammo, and the ammo would increase your DPS. Now, Thoradal rather handily produced its own ammo, so its own DPS had to be high enough to make up for not using timeless arrows, which increased DPS by 53. There's Apollon, the Soul Render, which was the highest DPS two-handed sword, and a sword that I think we all still see mogged quite frequently. These were powerful, cool items, and really that was reflected throughout the loot tables and guilds, especially before the Wrath of the Lich King pre-patch, who got that far. I mean, they were cemented as the best raiders on the server. Not just in terms of their progression, but sheer power level. They were so damn powerful after they'd done their clears. And that was that. All the content that the Burning Crusade would receive was in the game. This patch came out March 25th, 2008, a year and 3 months after the Dark Portal first opened. This patch, and the whole expansion, had a great degree of built-in longevity. So, while Wrath of the Lich King would release just under 8 months later, and there wasn't any content to bridge that gap, people really did not run out of things to do, because so many of them were still progressing. They were progressing through the past tiers whenever Sunwell released. Now, there is one part of the World of Warcraft experience that we've thus far neglected. It's not in the game, but it's something we all felt. It was the community. Because times were changing. Editing software was becoming both easy to use and easy to crack. Internet speeds were increasing. Warcraft movies and YouTube were on the rise. The likes of Warcraft Radio popped up. So yes, it is time to talk about community. Warcraft was a social platform in a time before Discord. Guilds were that social glue. The default hangout spot was Warcraft. Content creation was also on the rise as well, with the Titanic-level PDF guides of vanilla giving way to slick arena gank guides on YouTube, or spell rotation deep dives on WoW Insider. Things were becoming more polished. Videos like Nihilum's first kill against Illidan transformed them from just having some server fame to having worldwide fame. Then, there were endless raid guides recorded on terrible, terrible microphones, uploaded in poor quality. Some players thought that some of those guides were so bad that it was time for them to make their own. Much like, say, the guild Yogg, which of course went on to be Yogscast on YouTube, and many other examples. This was also the era of machinima, with dubs, PvP montages, and just every staple of the machinima genre not only being represented, but in some ways being created. Of course, all with those lovely janky WoW animations. You know, do it like a druid on the Discovery Channel. There was comedy shorts like Azerothian supervillains, which of course showcase the trials and tribulations of Illidan, Kael'thas, and Archimonde as they, try to do all of their villainous deeds and take over the world. We even had feature-length productions like Tales from the Past that showcased, people's incredible passion for the game. This whole scene was on the rise. But it wasn't just individual passion going on here. There was money to be made. Sites like WoW Insider were a bastion for class content and news. But, I remember it more for the weekly lore series and the deep, deep rabbit holes of their tinfoil hat articles. And that stuff was all going on back then. Does anyone remember the crazy old god location speculation article that they did? I mean, that got mileage right through to BFA. Incredible stuff. Perhaps the greatest resource, though, to come out of all of this was Wowhead. Originally, Wowhead was more just an online talent calculator, it was a utility so successful that Blizzard, in fact, redesigned their own talent calculator to actually match Wowhead's. But the site grew and grew and grew from there. There was user-generated data filling in their databases with items, NPCs, and just about anything you could possibly want to know or search for being there in TBC. And then with the attached comment section, I mean, it was filled of rage, BS, but also a wealth of useful information that would get upvoted to the top, making it an incredible community resource. This community success coalesced then around BlizzCon. Now, the first ever BlizzCon in 2005 was reportedly, a little bit of a letdown, a little bit low-key, and there was no BlizzCon in 2006. And that gave the impression to some that BlizzCon might not be a staple. But the success of this game coming out of vanilla and going into the Burning Crusade made it inevitable that, of course, months after TBC came out, BlizzCon 2007 happened, with 14,000 attendees. It was a different energy, with huge arena tournaments, the first cosplay competitions, and a community just galvanized by the game's incredible success, meaning that we saw those dev panels and people were just getting excited. You could not engage with the internet in 2007 and 2008 without seeing World of Warcraft. You just couldn't. You could barely even watch the regular television. I mean, we had actual cars being advertised via Nixia's lair. It became a staple and fed into some of the earlier memes that actually escaped into wider circulation, like, Keck, some of the account-crushing freakouts, merely a setback, and loads of other things. From Machinima to 9gag to Reddit to Something Awful, DeviantArt, YouTube, Warcraft movies, countless forums, World of Warcraft left an indelible mark on the modern world. It created, it spearheaded so much culture, and the Burning Crusade really is that era where the impact of World of Warcraft scaled and scaled and scaled as our community soared from 7.5 million active subs at the end of vanilla to around 11 million by the end of the Burning Crusade, as it rapidly approached its peak subscribers ever, which was of course achieved during Wrath of the Lich King. And there you go. That, in a big way, is the complete series of the Burning Crusade. We did it in 2 episodes, 2 very chunky episodes at that. There may be a little bit more in the future, though, because I hear some of you are interested in the lore. So, stay tuned. That is it for me. Have a wonderful day, and if you're about to hop through the Dark Portal, well, man, I can't wait. I'm excited for you. It's going to be so much fun. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.